Hello and welcome. Today, we're going to talk about something called thinking traps. And right off the bat, let's be really clear. These aren't some kind of personal flaw or a sign that you're doing something wrong. Not at all. They're just common, almost automatic patterns of thought that can quietly, shape our leadership, cloud our judgment, and kind of pull us out of alignment. So our goal here is simple, to bring them out into the open. So let's start with a really foundational question for you to think about. Are your thoughts leading, or are you? This really gets to the very heart of what we call presence-driven leadership. It's that core difference between moving through your day with real intention versus just being carried along by these automatic, unexamined thoughts. You can almost imagine these automatic thought patterns like an unseen current in a river, If you're not aware of it, this current can just pull you into reactivity or defensiveness or just poor judgment. Now, the work isn't to try and stop the current. That's pretty much impossible. The real work is learning how to navigate it with awareness and skill. So what exactly are we talking about when we say thinking traps? Well, you can see the definition here. Basically, they're these really common, automatic thought patterns that can end up distorting our perception of reality. They're like little shortcuts our brain takes, especially when we're stressed, but they don't always lead us to the most helpful place. And this is the absolute key. Just learning to see these traps is the most important step you can take. Seriously, the moment you can actually name a trap as it's happening, like, oh, there's that pattern again, you create a little bit of distance. And in that distance, that's where we reclaim our ability to choose. We get to move from unconscious reactivity to a conscious sense of responsibility for how we actually respond. Okay, so to make all of this really practical, we're going to map out this internal terrain. We'll group these traps into 3 basic categories. It just makes them a whole lot easier to spot when they show up in your day-to-day. Let's dive into the first one. So our first category is what we can call the traps of all-or-nothing reality. This is where we get forced into seeing the world in extremes. It's where all the nuance just disappears, and everything gets flattened out into these rigid opposite poles. A classic example here is black and white thinking. In a leadership context, this might sound like seeing a project as either a total success or a complete disaster. Or maybe seeing a team member as absolutely brilliant or totally incompetent. But, reality is rarely that simple, right? The alternative is to consciously look for the nuance, to embrace the shades of gray in performance, in progress, and in people. All right, let's move on to our second category. This one is all about the traps of faulty assumptions. This is where our minds try to fill in the blanks, often with information that's, incomplete or just plain inaccurate. Probably one of the most common traps here is mind reading. We just assume we know what someone else is thinking. For example, you might think, my boss was really quiet in that meeting. She must think my idea is terrible. The alternative? It's to trade that assumption for genuine curiosity. Instead of just making up a story in your head, we can actually ask clarifying questions, or at the very least, just consider that there are other possibilities. And our third and final category for today focuses on the traps of unfair standards. This is all about those unrealistic or overly critical expectations that we tend to place on ourselves and sometimes on other people too. This is really the home of that tough inner critic. This trap of the critical self is a heavy one. It's that feeling of carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders, of taking all the blame for things that are way outside of your actual control. Now, the alternative isn't to just avoid responsibility. It's to practice what we call balanced self-accountability. It's about honestly asking, okay, what part of this is actually mine to carry? And then holding ourselves to a standard that is fair and, frankly, humane. Okay, so it's one thing to see the traps. But how do we actually work with them in a real way? Let's get into a simple, repeatable framework for developing the skill of discernment, which is really just the ability to choose a more aligned path for yourself. The framework is a pretty straightforward 3-step practice. First, just notice. That's it. Acknowledge the unhelpful thought, but without judging yourself for having it. Don't fight it, just see it. Second, question. Get curious about it. Ask yourself, is this thought 100% true? What evidence do I actually have? What might I be missing here? And then third, reframe. This is where you consciously choose a more balanced, helpful, and realistic perspective. And this isn't about, forced positivity. It's about finding what's actually true. Now, here's why this matters so much. When we practice this framework consistently, we're not just managing our thoughts. We're building something much more essential.
internal authority. This is your capacity to self-govern your own focus and your own responses, to be able to consciously choose how you show up, rather than just being dictated to by an automatic thought or an external pressure.
So this isn't just some intellectual exercise, right? The whole goal here is to integrate this awareness into our daily leadership practice. Let's look at how we can actually move from just having the insight to putting it into action. Let's make this really practical. I've got a reflection prompt for you. Just take a moment and consider, where does one of these traps show up most often in your work? Is it during tough feedback conversations? Maybe when you're doing strategic planning, or when you're up against a tight deadline? You don't have to fix it right this second. Just noticing the pattern is a huge and powerful first step. And here's a little micro practice you can try this week. The next time you feel a really strong reaction, frustration, anxiety, maybe just irritation, just pause. Before you say or do a single thing, ask yourself one simple question. What thought is driving this feeling? That little inquiry all by itself starts to create some space. And in that space, you can make a more aligned choice. We'll end with a guiding principle that's at the core of this work: presence over performance and clarity over charisma. This isn't about being perfect. It's about cultivating the internal clarity and presence to lead from a place of genuine alignment and human dignity. So I'll leave you with this question. What one small step can you take today to choose presence over performance?